The truth behind the chemical imbalance theory is something that every person needs to know because it has shaped the way that millions of people see themselves. And for many, it's done more harm than good. Especially if you've ever just sat in a doctor's office with tears sitting behind your eyes and heard them say, you have depression just because your brain doesn't make enough serotonin. Or you'll be on meds for life. It's just how your brain is wired. Or maybe even your brain is broken, but this pill will fix it. This happy pill. At least that's what my doctor told me. I was told all of those things, and I'll be honest, at first, I believed them. Because when you're that low, when you wake up every single morning with a pit in your stomach and a fog in your head, when your laughter feels fake and your motivation is gone, when every tiny task just feels like climbing a mountain, of course you believe it. It's because you want a reason. You want something to explain why you feel like a freaking stranger in your own body. You just want to know that it's not your fault. So when the doctor told me that I have a chemical imbalance, something in me went still. It's like it just made sense. It just gave the pain a label. It gave my exhaustion a name. And for a moment, I felt some sort of relief. And just maybe, this little pill could give you my life back. And then the next part came where he said, this is something you're going to deal with forever and you'll need to be on medication long term. It just runs in your family and your brain just doesn't work the way that it should. And that's when something in me cracked because suddenly I wasn't just a person having a hard time. I was someone who was broken, defective. And now I needed a chemical crutch just to help me function. And I remember just walking out of the office feeling numb, not even just from my depression, but from that finality of what he told me, like my fate for the rest of my life at 16 years old had been sealed. Like I just got this life sentence that I didn't agree to. And leaving that doctor's office, something just didn't feel right. And there was a voice inside me that was like, this can't be it. This can't be my whole story. I didn't want to live a life where I believed that my brain was permanently damaged. I didn't want to wake up every day thinking that I was missing something that everybody else had. And most of all, I didn't want to believe that the best I could hope for was just managing symptoms. I couldn't accept that because I just felt deep down inside there had to be more. I just felt like, how could this be a serotonin deficiency? I'm a human being with a story, with pain, with stress, with a body that had been through things, and I was just trying to cope. So in that moment, despite having that gut punch of being told that I was broken, a little spark inside of me. And when I started to go on this journey, I really uncovered the truth of what it's like to really heal my brain, where I didn't have to wake up and rely on a pill for my well-being. And the healing that I went through, it wasn't just for me, it was for every single person who ever felt like they'd been trapped by a label. Every single person who'd ever been told, you won't be better without this pill. And so today I want to take you through the research behind the chemical imbalance theory. We're going to talk about where it came from, what the research today says, and what it means for you and your brain. I really want to emphasize here, this video isn't about me saying that medication is bad or wrong to take. It's your life. You do what feels good to you. This video is about you being educated so that you can make the right choices for yourself and your brain. And most importantly, this video is about you getting your power back, so that you don't feel helpless to an imbalance in your brain. Because once you come to accept that it's something outside of you, that it's making you feel like this, you become powerless to this thing outside of you. And you feel like you can never change, which is the exact place that I don't want you to be at. There isn't some sort of lack of deficiency within you that is causing you to feel like this. And so let's really uncover the truth in this theory. And we're going to start with going all the way back to where this theory began and ultimately became the story that millions of us believe today. Because once you understand the roots, you'll start to see how all of this slowly starts to fall apart and get you into that space where you finally get to ask yourself, what if the story that I was given isn't the truth of who I am? That's where we're going to start. So to really understand how we ended up in a world where millions of people believe that their brain is broken, we need to go back to the 1960s and 70s. So that's when scientists were first exploring how brain chemicals like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine might be linked to mood. And at that time, what was happening was that the researchers were experimenting with new psychiatric drugs, and some of them noticed that certain medications, like early versions of antidepressants, had effects on neurotransmitters like serotonin. So these drugs, called SSRIs, so that's short for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, were designed to keep serotonin hanging around in the brain for longer. And here's what they saw. When people took SSRIs, some of them reported feeling better. Some of them reported having a bit more energy, they felt less sad, the fog lifted a bit, and it looked like the medications help. So then came that big leap of that theory of if increasing serotonin makes people feel better, then maybe depression is caused by low serotonin. And that was it. That was the whole idea. It was never actually fully proven or confirmed with brain scans or blood tests or long-term follow-up studies. It was a theory that they formulated off of some, premature studies. And it felt easy to understand. It felt scientific and really, it gave people hope. Because if depression was just a chemical problem, if it was as simple as low serotonin, then the fix was just one pill away. And that idea was just pure gold. Pharmaceutical companies took it and ran with it. They started pouring billions of dollars into advertising. TV commercials showed happy, smiling faces with phrases like, "Depression is a chemical imbalance and we can help you correct it." They created this direct-to-consumer marketing campaigns that made it sound like you were broken without the drug and that you're whole again with it. At the same time, doctors were being trained to just repeat the message. Yeah, not because they were evil or misleading, but because the message was honestly everywhere. In textbooks, in journals, in medical conferences. So this theory, this guess, became the dominant narrative in mental health. It became what we call common knowledge today, and nobody questioned it. Even patients started to say things like, "Oh, it's just my serotonin," the same way someone might say, "It's just my blood pressure." But here's the thing that most people don't know is that there was never initially strong scientific evidence to prove that serotonin imbalance causes depression. Not back then, and honestly, not now. What started as a well-meaning theory got turned into a global campaign, and that campaign shaped how an entire generation to this day thought about their minds, their moods, and their identities. And that is what's so dangerous about it. It convinced millions that they were missing something inside of them and that the reason they were struggling wasn't stress or trauma or inflammation or lifestyle. It was simply that their brain didn't make enough of the happy chemicals. And this belief, it became a trap because once you believe your brain is permanently broken, you stop searching for deeper answers. You stop asking, why do I feel this way? And you stop believing that healing is possible without a pill. I see this in my practice all the time. People coming in being like their brain is broken. And I have to remind them again and again that your brain is not broken. Your brain is constantly building new cells, new connections, neurons every single day. How can your brain be broken if it's constantly rebuilding new things every single day? You need to actually learn how to support it in the right way. And so that brings us to today and to the massive study that finally went back to test this theory with the most advanced high-level research tools that we have. And what they found might just change everything you've ever been told. It does change everything you've ever been told. So the study that I'm talking about isn't just a study, and all the links are below. This is an umbrella review. And in the world of science and medicine, this is a very big deal. So think of it like this. Most studies look at one small question like, do people with depression have different serotonin levels? Or does one type of medication help more than another? But an umbrella review, that's not just one study, it's a review of the best reviews. It's like the research version of climbing to the top of a mountain. You're getting a bird's eye view of everything below, every study, every result, and every pattern. So it is very thorough. So here's how it works. First, researchers gather only the highest quality of studies, right? The ones that already reviewed dozens or even thousands of smaller trials. These are called systematic reviews and meta-analyses. They're very strict about how they collect data, and they often include thousands of participants from all over the world. Then what happens is that the umbrella review puts all of those top-level studies together and asks, what are we seeing across the board? What patterns keep showing up, and what's the truth that's hiding in plain sight? So this kind of research removes a lot of the noise. It's not influenced by one weird study with a small group of people. It really helps us to kind of cut through the confusion and gives us the clearest picture that science can offer. And in this case, the researchers asked a very powerful question. Is there any real, consistent, solid evidence that depression is caused by low serotonin or a chemical imbalance in the brain? And to answer this question, they didn't just look at one theory, they broke it down into 6 major areas of serotonin research. These are the 6 main ways that the serotonin theory has been explained, tested, and taught over the past few decades. So each one represents a slightly different angle of the same idea, that low serotonin is what causes people to feel depressed. Here are the 6 questions that they specifically asked. Number 1, do people with depression have lower levels of serotonin or its byproduct, which is 5-HIAA, in their body fluids? Number 2, are the serotonin receptors in the brain different in people with depression? Number 3, do people with depression have more serotonin transporter proteins, also known as SERT, which clear serotonin from the brain? Number 4, if you lower serotonin on purpose using a method called tryptophan depletion, does it cause depression? Number 5, is there a gene linked to serotonin that's more common in people with depression? And number 6, does that gene only cause problems when someone goes through stress? Meaning, is it the gene plus stress that leads to depression? As you can see, this was a deep, detailed, high-level investigation asking a very simple but important question. Does this theory hold up? Or have we built decades of mental health treatment on something that was never proven in the first place? What we're going to do is we're going to walk through all 6 of these categories together. I'm going to break each one down so it's very easy for you to understand so that you can see for yourself what the science really says. Because when you understand the roots of this theory, you'll understand why it's finally starting to fall apart and why that's not bad news. It's actually the start of something way more empowering. And with that being said, let's get into it. The first question they asked was, do depressed people have lower serotonin? This is the first and most obvious place to look, especially if you want to prove the chemical imbalance theory. Because if depression is really caused by low serotonin, then we should be able to see it in the body, right? That's exactly what the researchers set out to find. They looked at actual physical measurements of serotonin and its main byproduct called 5-HIAA. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. So these chemicals can essentially be measured in your blood, your plasma, your urine, and even in your spinal fluid, which is honestly as close as we can get to what's happening in the brain without slicing you wide open. Now here's why 5-HIAA matters. Serotonin gets broken down pretty quickly in the body, so scientists often look at it to get a sense of how much serotonin there was to begin with. It's kind of like checking the ashes to see how big the fire was. So what did this study find? Only one study showed that women with depression had slightly lower levels of serotonin in their blood. But, and this is important, that result didn't even reach statistical significance once the researchers adjusted for everything properly. And in science, if something doesn't reach statistical significance, it means that it could have been a random fluke. So basically, there was no strong proof that people with depression had less serotonin in their bodies. And here's where it gets even more interesting. When the researchers looked deeper, they noticed something else. People who were on antidepressants, even if they weren't currently depressed, were more likely to show lower serotonin levels. Let that sink in. The very drugs that are supposed to increase serotonin might actually decrease it over time. So now we have to ask, what are we really seeing here? Were these people actually low in serotonin because of depression? Or was it because of a medication they were taking for it? It's almost like seeing smoke in the air and assuming it's fire, but then realizing it's fog from a smoke machine that someone left on. It just turns this entire theory upside down. Because if antidepressants can lower serotonin in the long run, and if people with depression don't actually show lower levels of serotonin in their blood, their plasma, or their spinal fluid, what are we treating? What are we telling people when we say you're sad because your brain doesn't make enough serotonin? For decades, millions of people have believed that their suffering was due to a missing chemical, that they were fundamentally different from everyone else, that they were born broken. But this research says otherwise. The science doesn't back that up, and it changes everything in the best possible way. Let's move on to the next question, which is, are serotonin receptors different in people with depression? Let's talk about receptors first, because this is where the chemical imbalance theory tries to go even deeper with this. So if serotonin is the message, then receptors are kind of like the mailboxes on your brain cells. They receive the message and they help your brain respond to feeling happy, calm, focused, and motivated. Now imagine your brain has less serotonin. What would the smart body do? It would build more mailboxes, more receptors. Why? Because if there's less serotonin floating around, your brain would want to catch every last drop. So based on the chemical imbalance theory, we would expect that people with depression who supposedly have low serotonin would have more serotonin receptors. Their brains would be trying to make up for the lack. That's what researchers expected to find. But what did they actually find? It was the opposite. The two biggest, most trusted reviews looked specifically at the most well-known serotonin receptor called 5-HT1A. This receptor controls how much serotonin gets released. It's kind of like the thermostat of your serotonin system, helping it to regulate the temperature. And what these studies showed was not more receptors. In fact, people with depression had fewer receptors, or the same as people without depression. Not an increase. No sign that the brain was struggling to soak up the serotonin. This just, again, it flips the whole theory on its head. Because if low serotonin was a cause of depression, we would expect to see the brain reacting to that lack of storage. But instead, the brain doesn't even show signs of trying to compensate. It's showing signs that serotonin activity might be normal or even high. And here's another twist. Almost every study included in these reviews involved people who had, again, taken antidepressants currently or recently. And guess what antidepressants do? They change how receptors behave. They can increase or decrease the number of receptors. They can make them more sensitive or less sensitive. They basically rewire the system, which makes it really hard to know what's natural and what's caused by the medication. It's almost like walking into a room after someone has rearranged the furniture and trying to guess what it originally looks like. So those changes in receptors, they might have nothing to do with depression at all. They might just be the after effects of medication. One of the reviews was even labeled very low quality because it didn't clearly report the number of people in each analysis and used a one-sided p-value, meaning it was biased to find a certain result. So not only are the findings unclear, they may not even be reliable. What this shows us is something big. Even when we go deeper into the brain, even when we study how serotonin is received and processed, we still don't see proof that depression is caused by low serotonin. This part of the study helps us see just how much we've oversimplified something that is deeply complex. You are not a serotonin shortage. Your receptors aren't effective. And the more we look, the more we see. Depression is not about one broken part. It's about the whole system, the whole story. And I don't think that story can be reduced to a single chemical. Question number 3 is the serotonin transporter, SERT, higher in depressed people? So what is this serotonin transporter, also known as SERT? It is one of the most important pieces of the whole serotonin puzzle. So I want you to think of serotonin that sends like a text message to your brain, right? Saying like, hey, let's feel good today. Once that message is delivered, SERT acts as like a vacuum cleaner. It comes in and kind of sucks up the leftover serotonin to clear the space for the next signal. So the theory is that if you have too much SERT, it might clean up serotonin too quickly before your brain even gets a chance to respond to that message. That would leave less serotonin floating between your brain cells. So less signal means less communication, which technically should equal more depression. So scientists thought maybe people with depression just have higher SERT levels and that's why they feel low, right? Like it makes sense. But when scientists reviewed the best quality studies on SERT, including 3 large meta-analyses covering a total of 40 studies, they found chaos. Some brain areas showed lower SERT levels in depressed people. Some showed higher. Most showed no clear difference at all. It was just all over the map. There was no consistency, no solid pattern, and that's a big problem because if the chemical imbalance theory were true, we would expect a strong, obvious finding, but that's not what we see. What we see is confusion, contradiction, and inconsistency. So the question is, why? Well, here's something most of the studies had in common that might have actually blurred the results completely. Almost all the participants had taken antidepressants, and here is where it gets interesting. SSRIs, the most commonly prescribed antidepressants, are actually designed to block the SERT vacuum. That's how they work. They inhibit the serotonin transporter, so more serotonin stays active in the brain for longer. But when you do that over time, the brain adapts, it adjusts, it starts changing its own chemistry to respond to this new pattern. So when we look at people who've taken SSRIs and we find that their SERT levels are lower, we have to ask, is that because they were depressed or is it because their brain adapted to the drug? One of the researchers in the review even said that the findings likely reflect long-term medication effects, not depression itself. What makes this even more confusing, of course, is that only one of the reviews tried to test for the effects of medication use, and even that one didn't have enough data to make a clear judgment. Most of the studies don't include enough people who were drug naive, meaning people who had never taken antidepressants before. So we don't even know what their natural SERT levels were like before meds even entered the picture. On top of that, none of the 3 big reviews corrected for multiple testing, which means the risk of false positives was high, and one of them was marked as a very low quality study with poor reporting and unclear data. So what are we left with? No consistent patterns in SERT levels, major influence from long-term medication use, low quality analysis in some cases, and still no proof that higher SERT levels cause depression. If anything, these studies suggest that depression is not caused by too much serotonin being cleaned up too fast. Just absolutely wild if you ask me. Now, question 4. Can lowering serotonin cause depression? This looked at specifically tryptophan depletion studies. This is where things get even more interesting, as if they couldn't. Because scientists didn't just measure serotonin, they actually tried to manipulate it. And not in a bad way manipulation, but what they wanted to do is they wanted to know if low serotonin really causes depression, then what happens when we lower it on purpose? So they used a method called tryptophan depletion. Let me explain what that means. Tryptophan is an amino acid. It's one of the building blocks of protein, and your body uses it to make serotonin. So you get tryptophan from food, so from things like turkey, from eggs, from nuts, and seeds. Your body essentially takes that tryptophan, converts it into something called 5-HTP, and eventually turns it into serotonin. So scientists figured if we take away tryptophan, and the body can't make serotonin, and if the chemical imbalance theory is right, then people should feel worse, maybe even depressed. So how these studies worked is that the participants drank a specific amino acid shake that was missing tryptophan. So this temporarily lowers the body's ability to make serotonin, and then they measured mood 5 to 7 hours later, which is when serotonin should technically have been at the lowest point. So this was the most direct way science has to test this theory. So again, less serotonin should equal more depression, right? This should show up. So what happened? In healthy people, so people with no history of depression, nothing. They didn't experience any sadness, no anxiety, no emotional crashes. Even though their serotonin production was significantly lowered, their mood didn't change. That's a big deal, right? Because if low serotonin causes depression, then we should have seen something, like some sort of changes in these people, but we didn't. And so the researchers took it one step further. They then tested people who had a family history of depression. So people who might still be at more risk, and still nothing. There wasn't any really big changes that have happened. So even in people genetically predisposed, lowering serotonin didn't affect how they feel. And here's where this starts to get a little bit more complicated. In some studies, researchers looked at people who had been diagnosed with depression in the past or who were currently depressed. And in few of these studies, there was a small drop in mood after tryptophan depletion. But let's slow that down and really, really look at that, okay? So first, the drop in mood was small. Second, most of these participants were either currently taking antidepressants or had taken them recently. And we've already seen how medication can change how your brain responds to serotonin. So it's very possible that what we're seeing is not depression caused by low serotonin, but almost like a withdrawal reaction from people whose brains had been adapted to medication and were suddenly pushed into a chemical shift again. And even with all that considered, the effect was still weak. To make sure they weren't missing anything, the researchers went and found 10 more recent studies that weren't included in previous reviews. So they were essentially checking for the latest updates. And once again, the studies were clear. 8 of the studies were done in healthy volunteers. None of them showed any significant effect on mood. The 2 studies that involved people with depression showed some changes, but again, they were taking or had recently taken antidepressants. So it's impossible to tell whether the mood shift was from serotonin depletion or from the brain reacting to the absence of the drug it had adapted to. And it seems like that is the theme we keep seeing. The more medication someone has taken, the harder it is to study their natural brain chemistry. Their system has already been altered. Receptors have been shifted, transporters have been adjusted, feedback loops have been changed. So trying to study their brain and how it was before, it's like virtually impossible. The original baseline is now gone. What does all this mean? It means that even when scientists directly lower serotonin levels, it does not consistently cause depression. Not in healthy people, not in at-risk people, and not even clearly in depressed people unless they're already on medication. That's huge. Because if the serotonin theory were true, if depression was caused by low serotonin, then lowering serotonin should reliably trigger symptoms, but it doesn't, which forces us to face something even bigger. Maybe serotonin isn't the master switch that we thought it was. Maybe it plays a role, but not the central one. Maybe the story is more complex, more human, more rooted in stress, in trauma, in inflammation, in poor gut health, in blood sugar dysregulation, unmet needs, and resolved pain. Maybe the sadness isn't in the chemicals, it's in the system that has been overwhelmed and undernourished for too long. Which means that the real answer isn't in topping up serotonin, it's in healing what made the body feel unsafe in the first place. Now let's get into the last 2 questions about the serotonin gene and stress. And this is something that we've all been told at some point, that it runs in your family. If you've ever struggled with depression or anxiety and someone told you, oh, that's just your genetics, you're not alone. It's a message that just feels like it's been passed down like a fact, that your mom had depression, your uncle struggled with it, so of course it's written in your DNA. And for a while, science thought that they had found the exact gene responsible. The gene is called 5-HTTLPR, short for serotonin transporter linked polymorphic region. So let's break it down. This gene is basically the blueprint for making the serotonin transporter, the same SERT protein we talked about earlier, right? So that vacuum cleaner that clears serotonin from the brain. The theory was this, that some people have a shorter version of this gene, and people with this short version of this gene were thought to produce less of that serotonin transporter. This would lead to higher serotonin in the brain. But weirdly, researchers thought that this might be a problem if your brain can't regulate it properly. Eventually, scientists started to shift the theory. They started to say that, okay, maybe this gene doesn't directly cause depression, but what if it makes you more sensitive to stress? And so this became the gene-stress interaction theory. It suggested that a shorter version of that gene didn't cause depression on its own, but when combined with trauma, adversity, or high stress, it could tip someone into depression. And again, this was huge at that time. It felt like the missing piece. It explained why two people could go through the same thing, a breakup, a job loss, a rough childhood, but only one would fall into deep depression. Maybe it was a gene. And for a while, this idea really exploded in psychology and psychiatry classes. It was taught in textbooks, it became cited in papers, and it became one of the most influential theories in mental health genetics. And of course, as more data came in, more studies were done, the results just became more and more unclear. Some small studies showed a possible link between the gene stress and depression. Others didn't. So eventually, scientists decided to go big and run two massive, high-quality studies to settle the question once and for all. These studies used data from tens of thousands of people across multiple countries, multiple ethnicities, and a wide range of life experiences. And the results were clear. There was no reliable association between the specific gene and depression, and there was no consistent interaction between the gene and life stress. In other words, even if you had the short version of the gene, even if you'd been through trauma or loss or major life challenges, there was no strong proof that this gene determined how depressed you would become. This tells us that the chemical imbalance theory isn't genetic either. It's not locked into your DNA. It's not hard-coded into your brain, and it's not some genetic sentence you were born with and doomed to live. You are not your gene. You are not your past, and most importantly, you are not powerless because of your biology. And just to drive this point home, the latest and most trusted genetic research didn't just rely on published studies, it actually went back and did a reanalysis using raw data from past research, including unpublished results. They double-checked everything, and the conclusion stayed the same. No link, no interaction, no proof. So the story that depression is just something that you inherit, or that you're more sensitive to life because of a tiny gene sequence, it's not backed by strong science. Now, this doesn't mean that your family history doesn't matter, it does. But what you inherit isn't just genes. It's habits, nervous system patterns, coping tools, food traditions, beliefs about rest, resilience, and what to do when life gets hard. And that's something that you can actually change. After looking at every major angle of the serotonin theory, the researchers came to a bold conclusion. There is no convincing evidence that depression is caused by low serotonin or a chemical imbalance. Not even that it's inconclusive or more research is needed, but no convincing evidence despite decades of studies, billions of dollars, and millions of prescriptions written under that assumption. And this matters a lot. Because for the last 30 years, this theory hasn't just shaped science, it's shaped identity. It's shaped how people see themselves and their worth. When you believe that your sadness means your brain is broken, when you're told your emotions are the result of a biological flaw, when someone says you'll never feel okay unless you take something from the outside to fix you, it plants an incredibly dangerous seed. It plants a seed of hopelessness, a seed that says you're not enough on your own, you're defective, that you'll never feel joy, peace, or clarity unless a pill gives it to you. And that belief, it robs people of the power to explore what's really going on underneath. It keeps them locked in shame. It keeps them from healing. The truth is, your emotions are not chemical mistakes. They're messages, signals, cues from your nervous system, your history, your unmet needs, your overstressed body. They don't mean you're broken. They mean your body is asking for support. And finally, after decades of confusion, the science is catching up to that. Let me be clear here. Antidepressants can help. For some people in certain seasons of life, they can be stabilizing, they can bring relief, and in cases of deep, life-threatening depression, they can be life-saving. I'm not shaming people here, but I want you to know the truth, because we need to stop repeating the phrase, they fix a chemical imbalance. That narrative is outdated, it's unsupported, and it's misleading millions of people every single year. It's also keeping people on medications long-term who might not need them. It's making people afraid to ever come off them because they think their brains won't work without them, and it's putting doctors in a position where prescribing becomes a reflex instead of a thoughtful decision. Even the World Health Organization, the highest public health authority we have, agrees. Their guidelines now say that antidepressants should not be the first line of treatment for depression. And they issue a warning that focusing too much on medication makes us ignore the actual root causes of emotional pain. So things like trauma from childhood, relationships or experiences we never got to process, loneliness, feeling unseen, chronic stress from jobs, parenting, caregiving, or survival, poor sleep, poor nutrition, which starves the brain of the building blocks it needs, lack of purpose, lack of movement, living in survival mode where your nervous system is stuck in fight or flight and can't find safety. None of these things can be solved by a pill alone because they're not caused by a chemical imbalance. They're caused by a life imbalance. This is exactly why I practice the way that I do. I don't treat chemical imbalances, I treat humans. And when someone walks into my office and they say they feel numb, sad, anxious, stuck, I don't ask what's wrong with your brain. I ask, what is your body trying to tell us? Because depression to me is not a flaw, it's a signal, it's a messenger, it's a red flag that something is off. And when we listen, when we stop labeling and start investigating, we find things that make sense, things that can be worked on, things that are treatable. So in my practice, we look deeper. We test for inflammation because chronic inflammation impacts brain function. We look at nutrient deficiencies like B12, iron, magnesium, or omega-3s, which your brain needs to create your neurotransmitters. We look at your gut health because 90% of your serotonin is made in your gut. We look at blood sugar imbalances because sugar spikes and crashes affect mood energy. We look at liver overload because if you can't detox hormones or toxins, they build up and affect mood. We look at hormonal shifts, especially in women where PMS, perimenopause, and thyroid dysfunction can mimic depression. When the body is out of balance, the brain feels that imbalance. And when you support the body, when you clear the inflammation, feed it what it needs, calm the nervous system, and create safety, the brain starts to come back online. People start to feel like themselves again, not because we forced it with a drug, but because we gave their body permission to heal. If there's only one thing you take away from this video, please let it be this. You are not broken. You are not defective. You are not missing some magical chemical that everyone else has. And most importantly, you are not stuck in this way forever. You are a powerful, intelligent, resilient person who may be hurting, but who is also capable of healing. I know this not just because of science, but because I've lived it. I've taken antidepressants before, and for a time they helped. I don't regret it, but I also remember the day I forgot to take my pill. It was only one day, and it felt like the entire world was collapsing. My mood crashed, my energy dropped, I felt disconnected from myself, and in that moment, I thought, I never want to be this dependent on something outside of me again. That was my turning point. Not to reject medication, but to stop putting it on a pedestal, to start asking what my body really needed and to get curious instead of scared. And that's what I want for you. This topic, it's personal, it's emotional, and it matters more than we've been taught to admit. So let's talk about it. Have you ever been told that your brain was broken, that you had a chemical imbalance? Were you relieved or angry or confused? Have antidepressants helped you or have they hurt you? I want to hear it because your story matters. So drop a comment below and let's open up the kind of conversation that brings truth, science, and empowerment back into the mental health space, because you deserve more than a label. You deserve more than a lifelong prescription. You deserve real answers. You deserve real support, and you deserve to heal fully and for real.